As someone who shoots lots of photo and video, I've been a fan of the Sony Alpha cameras, especially the likes of the beast, the Sony A7S III. It's a photo camera with amazing video features like recording 4K up to 120 frames per second without any crops, and being able to have that dual base ISO of 640 and 12,800. That's just unheard of. However, no matter how many amazing features it had, there's still something about it that just made me feel like there was something wrong. It's not the camera, maybe it just was me. That camera was just too much for me. When I heard that the Sony FX30 was a lot like the A7S III, let alone the FX3, but for half the price, I just thought, for the features and the specs, that FX30 might be the camera for me. Let's talk about what makes the Sony FX30 such an attractive camera and why you won't need full frame for video. Hey fam, mga kapatid, I'm Mike, nurse photographer and videographer, and I make videos about camera gear as well as tutorials for new photo and video shooting. If you watched my first video on the FX30 upon its announcement, you might recall me saying that I was willing to sell my only A7S III for two FX30s. That is true, I got it right here and right over here. This video is a follow-up to that. I'm making this video to help process my thought as well as to help those of you who are trying to find a great value-packed camera without having to pay more than $2,000 for just the body alone. When it comes to the APS-C sensor versus a full frame, it's without a doubt that full frame will give you advantages in many cases over your crop sensor, except for the overall financial cost to invest in the full frame system itself. If money were not a problem, I think all of us would be shooting full frame. As someone who used to own the nearly $1,400 Sony a6600, I'm just blown away by how much they actually included into this FX30 and only charged us $300 more. For an iPhone 14, you take $300 and you can go from 128 gigabytes of storage to 512 gigs of storage. But you take that same $300 and put it towards the Sony APS-C camera and you'll get more than just a tiny spec bump. Here's why you can still be excited about the Sony FX30 even though it's not full frame. Right off the bat, let's talk about the video-centric features of this thing. Tally lights, it's not overrated. You hit record and there's 3 different lights that go on and you'll have confidence that you're recording. You see, those brain cells that you got spending worrying about whether or not you actually hit record can be dedicated to talking to the camera and making your video come together. In addition, overheating is not an issue as it's got its own fan built into the back. You see, with those earlier Sony Alpha 6000 series cameras, although you could record 4K, you had to fight off the overheating issues. You had to do things like pull the screen away from the body, change the temperature warning from normal to high, this and that. This thing has its own fan. You can record 4K at whatever setting without worrying about overheating. Now that's peace of mind. How about embedded LUTs in the footage? You see, this was one of the main reasons why I bought this camera, was to make my workflow easier in delivering content like this without having to spend extra time in the video editing software. I already know what kind of look I'm going for. So for me to just have it baked into the footage without having to buy another external monitor like the Atomos Ninja 5, adding bulk to my setup, it's a no-brainer. And of course, 4K up to 60 and 120 frames per second. I'm upset that the Sony's A7 IV has a crop in 4K 60. I would have been okay if it was only cropped at 4K 120 frames per second, but if I got to spend $3,000 plus to get 4K 60 without crop, Sony, I love you, but you're out of your mind. You see, the difference between this camera and the Sony A7 IV is that at least I'm using the whole sensor for 4K 60, as opposed to the full frame sensor from the A7 IV, you're only using a tiny bit of that. For 4K 60, spending over $2,000, I think even $2,500. I'm good here for $1,700. For my favorite general features in a camera that are also included in the FX30, well, of course, we got a flip screen. I love my low shots, and I also like having a minimal setup if I ever need to see myself without adding a monitor on the top. This is also proving itself to be handy when shooting vertical video too. I mean, look at that, it just comes in clutch. Another important feature is that, of course, this takes photos and videos. Although you won't be taking pictures of action sports with this, you can surely pull off a couple's photo shoot. In regards to my favorite Sony Alpha features, we have the new menu, of course, and on top of that, it's also touchscreen. I mean, it's just easier to breeze through the menus than before, and I just like how the FX30 has its own dedicated menu for the video settings. We may not have the mode dials in this camera, but we got 2 shooting menus we can customize. In addition, Sony's included the feature where you can separate your photo exposure settings from your video exposure settings, so you don't have to meddle with your settings when you're going back and forth between photo and video. Before I mention one of the biggest perks of this camera, here are some honorable mentions for the features: weather sealing, customizable buttons, and the latest Sony color science along with S-Cine tone for your picture profile. So one of the biggest perks of this camera, since it's a Super 35 sensor or an APS-C sensor, we have Super 35 lenses that we can choose from. Whether cinema lenses or not, we don't have to spend lots of money on a single body of glass, like on a full frame body. But we can buy a couple manual lenses or so for the price of a single full frame lens. I've already got myself a Helios lens, but I've also got the Sigma 16mm, which is on this camera right now, a 30mm f1.4, and these lenses have been out for a while. So whether or not you've been shooting photo or video for the first time, or it's been years, the great lenses are more affordable now than before. I mean, if you got APS-C lenses, be happy that you don't have to reinvest in new glass. If you really want full frame, you could just take that $1,700 and invest in a used Sony full frame body like the A7 III with specs and features that don't even match what I got here in an FX30. Sony's full frame A7SIII for $1,798 doesn't even have video offerings and features like the FX30. For a similar price point, we can get an extra stop of light, more shallow depth of field with nice bokeh. But is that worth having over all the features that I just mentioned about this camera? Those things are nice, but I would pass on that on the A7C because I personally don't need full frame. But don't get me wrong, it's still a cute full frame camera though. Anyway, I filmed some weddings, done a few photo shoots, but I'm really just a hobbyist who loves creating. I truly believe that this camera is more than enough for me. And I'm not just saying that because I bought the camera. I can still return it and just keep using the A7S III. I mean, I've only had this camera for a week, but I'm already loving it. Prior to getting my A7S III, I owned the Blackmagic Pocket 4K camera. It was the first time I ever owned and ever tried using a cinema camera. Despite it having the micro 4/3 sensor, which is smaller than this, I mean, it's definitely not known for being a champion in low light. But I was just so shocked to see how well images were produced from that camera. Don't call me promiscuous, but man, I fell in love with that camera too. However, the only reason why I didn't stick with it for long was because as a solo content creator, I need autofocus. That's just the way I shoot. As someone who does this in my free time while also working a full-time job as a nurse, it's not worth setting up a beautifully manually focused shot if it means my process takes 2 to 3 times longer and it'll be a while before I publish my next video. I mean, talk about friction, right? Although the camera was very good in shooting video, what I also really needed was photo. And shooting photos with micro 4/3 was not the vibe I was going for. And that camera really isn't for shooting photo. The Sony A7S III did more than meet my needs, and it was amazing. But I always felt like I wasn't even using 75% of its potential. I felt somehow I wasted money on it. Yes, the specs of the camera are worthy of desire, and for the price of $3,500, you are really getting what you paid for. But for someone who feels like he's only using 50% of the camera's full power, the FX30 for half that price sounds more like the camera for me. I could sell the A7S III and invest in 2 FX30s, sell some full frame glass and get some smaller yet nice glass. And I can still take great photos. Yeah, this camera isn't perfect. I can't shoot burst photos. It's only got an electronic shutter. There's a crop at higher 4K frame rates. It'll be an extra expense to build this into a rig if I really wanted to. But at the end of the day, I feel satisfied using up 75% of a $1,700 camera than 50% of a $3,500 camera. Going from full frame back to APS-C can sound silly. But how about you? Does sensor size really matter to you? No cap, full frame is beautiful, but it's not everything. Maybe one day I'll go back to it for more dedicated photography, but for now, I'm confident in the FX30 for most of what I do. The A7S III is great, but you know what's better than the A7S III? 2 FX30s. I'm glad to have them as my workhorses for this channel in addition to my everyday filming and photography. Thanks again for watching. Now go out there and shoot for the life that matters. See ya!